In this video, I'm going to talk about the relationship between genetic variation and something that our ecologists and evolutionary biologists call clines. So for the last several videos, I've been talking about human skin pigmentation, how it has been acted on by natural selection, and I'll talk about some of the geographic patterns in specific. We're generally familiar with these, but I'll be more specific about those geographic patterns and how that variation in those geographic patterns there's an underlying genetic cause to it. So here is a tree, a phylogenetic tree that is showing different human populations that were studied in a paper: West Africans, East Asians, and Northern Europeans. Over evolutionary time, we know the human species originated in Africa. Human populations stayed in Africa, and those human populations eventually resulted in West Africans. Some populations left Africa, and some of them settled directly north in Northern Europe, and others moved east to East Asia. And what this tree is doing is showing that how using the genes and the time using genomics, that researchers have hypothesized different genes were under natural selection. So originally, selection was all humans lived in Africa, so there's selection for darker pigment, though obviously there was variation. We actually see variation north to south within Africa depending on pigmentation. And there's actually even been recently, these are genes that in relatively recent West African population, there's evidence that there has been natural selection acting on them to optimize skin pigmentation for those particular environments. And then these are other genes that at various phases in human history and human populations have been under natural selection. And this results in the different patterns of skin pigmentation we see across different populations of humans, as natural selection has acted to optimize human traits for particular environments. So here is a map showing globally patterns in skin pigmentation. We'll focus generally on the Old World, on Africa, Europe, the Indian subcontinent, East Asia, Oceania, and Australia. This is human origins. Humans originated out of Africa and migrated through Asia and finally arrived and moved south here. So the patterns, evolution has been acting on human skin pigmentation the longest in Africa and Asia. The equator is here, and these brown colors indicate, brown and dark brown colors indicate relatively darkly pigmented populations. Purple is less pigmented, pink, and so forth. What's interesting is that these black patches are not exactly on the equator. These darker brown patches, not black, they indicate populations that have on average the highest levels of pigmentation of human populations. This is in Ethiopia, I believe. This is in Chad or Cameroon. This is West Africa, Senegal, Mali, Guinea, and then down here is Angola, I believe. One thing that's in particular about these is West Africa. This band here is all in semi-desert area called the Sahel. It's very open. Individuals, many of these populations are pastoralists. They spend a lot of time out with their livestock, and so they are exposed to the sun a lot. Whereas just further south here, where there's less pigmentation, this is increasingly more savanna and forest. And in general, the equator in Africa is heavily forested, and it's only in these areas where populations lived out in more drier desert areas that we reach the highest levels of skin pigmentation. Also here in Ethiopia, these are individuals that live in relatively dry, arid areas at high elevations. So we move further north, populations become relatively less pigmented until we get to North Africa and Spain, the Middle East, or northern Middle East, Syria, and Turkey. What's interesting, though, is that human populations left Africa and then moved east. And so as we move east, we actually see a pattern of increasingly darker pigmentation as we move into the Indian subcontinent, and then again as we move south through Oceania into Australia. So even though individuals had to move all the way out of Africa through Asia in order to get to Australia, they likely faced selective pressures to evolve to be less pigmented. Then as they move south, increasing pigmentation to the point where the indigenous peoples, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, return to being as dark as individuals from Africa. Scientists have studied human pigmentation and across different populations, and in this case, this graph is showing the relationship between latitude, or how far north or how far south from the equator a population is, and how much the skin reflects. So low reflectance, when a substance, including human skin, has a low reflectance to light, that means it is absorbing most of the light, and so it is dark skinned. So this is indicating that among the populations studied here, on average, the lowest reflectance, therefore the darkest skin, occurred at the equator. Then this is not actually showing the raw data, but this is the general pattern. As you move north out of Africa, skin reflectance tends to increase, and high reflectance means a lot of light is being reflected or bouncing off. That means low absorbance, low pigmentation, and light skin. So this is showing the trend of moving north out of Africa, or out of Central Africa, into northern Africa, Spain, Greece, on up into Northern Europe, Norway, England. So we move south here, we actually see the similar pattern. So this is always a good thing when evolution works this way. The pattern we see moving north is the pattern we see moving south. Doesn't matter which direction we're heading. Even within Africa, as you move south, you tend to see lighter skin pigment, higher skin reflectance, which means lighter skin. We can match up this graph. We can take this line graph and flip it on its side so it matches up, and you can see the general pattern here, where as you move north out of away from the equator, and I didn't line this up perfectly, the 0 here should be on the equator, but as you move north out of the equator, skin becomes more reflective, indicating lighter skin. As you move south out of the south away from the equator, becomes lighter skin. That's reflecting these populations in South Africa that are relatively lightly skinned. So just as you reach the Tropic of Capricorn or Tropic of Cancer, I actually forget which one is which, but in both places, that's where you start to reach increasing number of light-skinned. However, Africa doesn't extend as far south as it does north. There's no continent south of Africa, so as human populations continue to move north, they continue to evolve lighter skin. This pattern ecologists call a cline, ecologists and evolutionary biologists. And this is a cline is used in two circumstances. One, anytime we see continuous variation in a trait or in a phenotype, we call it a cline. So human skin pigmentation varying with latitude or with elevation, as it does in Ethiopia. That is a cline, or it can be specifically with an allele. If we see variation in the frequency of an allele, that also constitutes a cline. And because we know the genetic basis and we can genotype individuals, we can see how the variation in allele frequencies matches up with variation in skin pigmentation. So this is a particular gene, SLC245A5. There was one allele of this gene which happened to be strongly associated with light skin pigmentation, so these researchers assayed for this particular allele across dozens of populations around the globe. Areas that are white, that is where the allele is almost completely absent, whereas the darker colors, darker green, increases the allele is more common. Until you get green, it is entirely fixed when you get to Northern Europe, to the Scandinavian countries, Russia, England. Again, what's interesting is we see this pattern. So as within Central Africa, this particular allele of this gene is almost absent. As you move south in Africa, you do start to see its frequency increases a little bit. So this particular allele does increase. This map is a little hard to read because you have to flip it around. White here means darker pigmented. Green here, this is indicating the presence of the allele, and the lighter pigmented skin. As we move away from Central Africa, skin pigmentation tends to decrease, and so until this allele is increasing in frequency until we get up into Europe, where the allele is completely fixed. Completely fixed or almost fixed. However, as we turn the corner into the Middle East, into the Pakistan, the Indian subcontinent, we start to see the allele starts to decline in frequency and go all the way down through India until it declines quite a ways. And what's interesting is the frequency that it is in the tip of India and Sri Lanka is similar to the same latitude here. So the pattern that we see in Africa, the allele changing in frequency as we move north to south in Africa, is similar to the pattern we see in India. It is interesting, though. This is an allele that's mostly most strongly associated with skin pigmentation patterns, geographic patterns in Africa, Europe, and Central Asia. India, the allele disappears in China and Eastern China, Eastern Russia, where it doesn't matter, even though individuals are generally lightly skinned. All throughout here, the allele is entirely absent. So again, we have a cline here, and this is where this clinal pattern repeats itself. We've seen this cline within Africa, north to south. We also see it from northwest to southeast throughout the Indian subcontinent here. So in Pakistan and Kashmir, I believe those are up here, this allele is almost completely fixed. But then as we move towards Bangladesh, the allele decreases in frequency. As we move south through India towards Sri Lanka, the allele is almost declines in frequency also. Something that's interesting here is this shows how complicated the genetic basis of human skin color is, and how the concept of race is much more complicated than the easy categories. One of the stories you see from this graph is this gene and this allele is associated with light skin pigmentation, and it shows up all throughout Europe, but also through the Middle East, and also throughout northern India, and also northern Africa. So this gene is very important for driving the overall light skin pigmentation of individuals throughout these populations. And this is a wide swath of what some people would consider different races, but they are all unified by the fact that they have the same gene that's very important to driving their skin color. So our concept of race does not match up with the underlying genetics. Similar patterns of clines show up with sickle cell anemia. So in this case, dark red is showing that the recessive allele associated with sickle cell anemia is common. So this part of Central Africa, parts of West Africa here, it's very common. Also shows up a little bit in southern part of Europe, the Middle East, and also India. This map here in green shows the distribution of Plasmodium falciparum, the most potent malaria parasite. You'll notice that the darkest green color is where the parasite, or the malaria parasite, is most abundant, and it's in Central Africa, parts of West Africa, southern Europe. This is historically, malaria has been eradicated from most of Europe. This is historically where it was. And then also India, where it's still a problem. And you'll notice these maps match up. Where there's dark red colors, there's typically dark green colors, including these little spots in West Africa, India. So this is showing a decline in the frequency of alleles, and also geographic variation in the distribution of a species and how they match up. And this provides some of the evidence for the role of malaria in the maintenance of the alleles that result in sickle cell anemia.